Recently, I read a report published by the World Health Organization in 1952, 70 years ago. They were studying primarily homeless children, most displaced as a result of World War II, but they also studied children who otherwise had significant behavioral problems. The author had been a psychiatrist for many years and had surveyed all the world's literature at the time about child development. Imagine, all the world's literature. They didn't have as many journals then, and had studied the development of mental health disorders in children, himself and in the literature. First, the more I read, the more I realized that the report was describing exactly the behaviors we see today in children from 1952. Whining, anger, arguing, resistance, fighting, withdrawal, isolation, depression, suicidal thoughts, failure to connect with others, anxiety, worry, frustration, crying, short attention span, all symptoms that we now call ADHD, lack of engagement with tasks, lack of responsibility. And of course, we've added, a few more in our day just to round out the picture, like addicted to phones, games, social media appearance. They didn't have all that back then. Cutting, gender confusion. We just added a few modifications. The second thing I noticed was that even though he could easily have blamed all these problems on a world war that had just ended, he didn't. And he didn't blame governments, see if this list sounds familiar, or the schools, or a particular race of people, or systemic social whatever. In fact, he didn't blame anybody. I felt like I'd stepped into another world where victimhood hadn't yet begun to spread like the pandemic virus it is now, much worse than COVID-19. So what did he say? He simply described the observations of all the studies he had read, the interviews he'd had with hundreds of mental health care professionals, and his own lifetime of observations. What did he learn? This matters. He concluded that it was not the physical disasters or wars that affected children most. I was dumbfounded. He didn't blame trauma like we'd like to do now. He didn't come up with a name like ADHD to explain away the real problem. He said, quote, that intimate attachments to other human beings are the hub around which a person's life revolves. From these intimate attachments, people draw strength and enjoyment of life. And he concluded that children deprived of this intimate attachment responded to difficult circumstances in a far less healthy way. In fact, he found that the primary cause of mental health disorders in children was the lack of these intimate attachments, usually with parents. Wow. What word could be used to exactly replace what the report called intimate attachments to other human beings? Well, this ain't hard. The author was talking about love. But psychiatrists and the World Health Organization reports live by an unwritten but strict rule that the word love may never be used. Why? Well, they don't know what love is. They haven't felt it. So how could they describe it, much less prescribe it? The report continued. Those children who had fairly good family relationships before separation could usually be helped to adjust, to be happy. But those with a bad family background had very poor prognosis. Quote, there's a steady growth of evidence that the quality of the parental care that a child receives in his earliest years is of vital importance for his future mental health. End quote. How many times have I said exactly that? Notice the phrase vital importance. He was saying a child cannot be emotionally or mentally healthy without love. They noticed that in 1952, but they couldn't bring themselves to call it love, and nobody really did anything with the report. The report continued. What is believed to be essential for mental health is that the infant and young child should experience a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with his parent. If children don't get the unlimited love from their parents, I had to stop and shake my head. He used the word love and used the word unlimited, which is remarkably close to the word unconditional. they saw a glimpse of the power of unconditional love back in 1952. Then the report continued, if they don't get that love, they will have, the children, quote, revenge upon their parents for not loving them enough. They saw the acting out of children as being a reaction to the pain of not being loved, a kind of revenge. And we see children every day treat their parents in what look like vengeful ways. It's not conscious. Disrespect, disregard, ignoring, dismissing, insulting, and even assaulting. Quote, the report, a child without this relationship suffers. That's the pain we talk about so often. And this can happen even with a child living with his parents if the parents are not loving. End quote. Freaked me out. In 1952, they got a picture of it. They didn't hang on to it, but they got a glimpse. Quote, even a partial lack of love brings on anxiety, excessive demanding, and powerful feelings of revenge, guilt, and depression. Complete deprivation of love can cripple a child, and if a child is deprived of a parent's love, mental illness is far more likely to occur. End quote. Then they made some interim conclusions. Quote, the issue of whether a lack of love causes psychiatric disturbance is still discussed. Now, listen closely, because he's making fun of the scientific community in much the same way I sometimes do. The issue of whether a lack of love causes psychiatric disturbance is still discussed by experts as though it were an open question. But now there is no room for doubt. He's making fun of therapists that the lack of loving connection, and he is one, the lack of loving connection has grave effects on a child's character and entire life. If further research is to be fruitful, it must pay minute attention to the quality of the love a child is receiving. End quote. Wow. A glimpse 70 years into the past. This report in 1952 is remarkably insightful, and he says that it goes against the science of the day because they ignored it. We're ignoring it now, still, and have been for 70 years, no, way longer than that, but since then. We cannot afford to destroy our children in this way. But I'm very hopeful about those of you who are listening to this message right now. It is in you that the world will find hope.